Greetings, students. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the shadowy second pillar of the conspiracy that we glimpsed on November 22nd, 1987. As you, my students, know, these occult happenings tend to express themselves in psychic spaces that hum with coincidence and symmetry. That is the reason that scholars thereof mine the contexts of these events for clues to their meaning. In our second video of this series, we pointed out the cascading and strange meanings of the sports broadcast that was interrupted by the first signal intrusion. But we left the second signal intrusion untouched. Now let us pick up where we left off then. The second hijack interrupted the British science fiction program Doctor Who, specifically the multi-episode story The Horror at Fang Rock. Immediately after cutting off the broadcast, the entity declares, "That does it, he's a freaking nerd." This epithet, nerd, appears once more later in the Max Headroom broadcast, and we'll cover that shortly. But first consider the plot of the show being interrupted. There is a lot of murder and confusion in the way, but the core event is an interplanetary war between two alien factions, the shape-shifting Rutan and the clone race of Sontorans. The races that are pitted against each other are opposites along genetic lines. While the Rutan are flexible, able to quickly change and adapt, seemingly altering their genetic material on the fly, the Sontorans are the exact opposite. Each one is a precise clone of each of the others from a genetic point of view. The domination of the shape-shifting Rutan by the clone army of Sontorans is the central theme of the galactic drama of this episode.
You're at last losing that interminable war with the Sontarans.
That is a lie!
Is it?
The achievement of genetic monotony is a theme elsewhere in the hack as well. Consider this odd boast that,
"Oh, I just made a giant masterpiece for all the greatest world newspaper nerds."
This is overtly an allusion to the call sign of the television station hacked in the first broadcast. WGN stands for World's Greatest Newspaper. This is because the station was owned by the Chicago Tribune, and that is their motto. But then there's that word again. Nerds. Who are the world's greatest newspaper nerds? Well, at the risk of being crass, I'll venture a suggestion that it is their science reporters. The previous year, they had been awarded the Pulitzer Prize for a series on none other than genetic modification. In addition to the obvious connection between science writers and nerds, we even have our earlier example of the entity referring to the characters in the genetically charged episode of Doctor Who as... what was it? Oh yes, nerds. The work of these men was certainly trailblazing in a sense. In the book adapted from their Pulitzer Prize-winning articles, Altered Fates, Gene Therapy, and the Retooling of Human Life, they spend many pages praising the work of Stanfield Rogers, an American researcher who had come under such fire by bioethicists that he was forced to retire from his post as head scientist at a prestigious West Coast university. Other headlines in the series include such evocative titles as Gene Therapy, Reshaping Our Future, and Making Man Over, Gene Therapy's Revolutionary Potential. The series is almost propagandistically pro-gene therapy, describing its critics as scared silly. Throughout the series, the genetic tamperers are consistently given the final word. The first sentence of another article in this series, The Gene Splicers Toil Over Tiny Bubbles, reads, "Richard Mulligan loves viruses." It goes on to explain that certain viruses are used in gene therapy to deliver approved genetic material and overwrite the natural code. This pulls tight another of our hanging threads from an earlier video. Recall in contexts when we determined that the initiation into the Knights Templar pictured in this video oddly declared fealty to Beelzebub instead of Baphomet? We now have a convincing reason why. According to Pierre Klosowski, in his book on Baphomet, the name of that demon derives from a Latin formula indicating the king of alchemy, Basilius Philosophorum Metallicorum. Eliphas Levi's famous drawing of that figure with its focus on the union of opposites and its diabolical stateliness corresponds with that notion. However, this new illuminated group does not pursue alchemy. They pursue another science altogether, virology. This is particularly appropriate to the worship of Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies and Chief of Pestilence. By hijacking viruses, the genetic engineers seek to rewrite the DNA of their subjects. Who better to bless them? Now remember that the entity claimed to make a huge masterpiece for the world's greatest newspaper nerds. What masterpiece had that entity created for them? We of course only have theories and postulates, but I want to bring up a piece of evidence that we touched on briefly in our video on subliminal advertising. This paper is a CIA brief entitled The Operational Potential of Subliminal Perception. In that video, we described it as a piece of propaganda to disclaim the potential of subliminal perception to influence individuals. But read more closely, in light of the genetic regulation project trumpeted by the Chicago Tribune, there is another message hidden between the lines. The parts that seem to be dismissing the practice state, if a somewhat homogeneous sample of people is tested a number of times, most of them will be sensitive most of the time to the subliminal cue. And later, with such a large number of variables and relatively low reliability, it is difficult to determine whether the controlled variable or uncontrolled artifacts are producing whatever results one does observe. Here the grammar is attempting to drive home the point that, with the population being as diverse as it is, subliminal control is not feasible. However, it doesn't take much imagination to flip this. If the population were not as diverse as it is, subliminal control would be feasible. Was this missive a call to action that was merely being presented as a summary of insufficient potential? The genetic engineering project, which the Chicago Tribune had been lauded for peddling to the public, as well as whatever weird ingredients were being sugar masked in new Coke, both have conspicuous ties to the entity which claimed to be Max Headroom. In our next video, we will discuss what it was that these two prongs were softening the population up for, and the ultimate reason behind the cultivation of Max Headroom itself. Until next time, may the pyramid's eye watch over us all.